As we saw in our last lecture, the creation of biblical art faced the challenge of how to combine the artist's individual vision and abilities with the beliefs and traditions associated with the text which was considered sacred scripture. This challenge has been just as much a part of attempts throughout the history of the West to introduce scenes and ideas from the biblical narrative into aspects of popular culture: play, poems, music, novels, movies, games, and TV shows. So has the Bible been treated like other works of literature to be adapted and modernized like any book or play? And if so, how have God and the other figures we find in the Bible been treated as dramatic characters? Do they share the same flaws, motivations, and challenges as the other protagonists of fiction? Let's begin with a couple of examples of how Jews have made use of texts from the Bible. One of their greatest sources of inspiration has been the story of the Exodus, which is one of the more compelling episodes of the Hebrew Bible and was, for both Israelites and Jews, the event that turned them into a nation. This event has often been restated and restaged over the course of Jewish history. The oldest surviving case of this is several fragments from a Greek tragedy, Greek that is, in both form and language, written by a Hellenistic Jew named Ezekiel who lived in the area of Alexandria. This play, which covered the events of Exodus through the crossing of the Red Sea, was modeled after a famous Greek tragedy that also dealt with a past historical event, The Persians, written by the classical Athenian playwright Aeschylus. While the play's chief protagonist is Moses, God himself also appears as a character in the burning bush scene. He also tells Moses about the rituals of Passover, just as he does in Exodus chapter 12. In both of these scenes, we can see a great deal of shared language between the original text of the Septuagint and Ezekiel's adaptation of it, though the author seems to have felt free to make the language sound more like the poetry of an ancient Greek play. While his artistic decisions show a certain willingness to improve on the original text, we might ask whether the fact the Septuagint was, after all, a translation made it less sacred than the original Hebrew in the eyes of Ezekiel's Jewish audience. A much later retelling of the Exodus story, and one which continues to this day, is the Passover Seder. At the center of the Seder, which is a combination of studying, discussion, and eating, is the Haggadah, which is constructed around verses quoted from the story of the Exodus, along with traditional interpretations of them. And the participants, often a combination of family and friends, are encouraged to ask their own questions and to discuss this material and what they think about it. As we saw in a previous lecture, Haggadot were a common venue for visual expression, and the scenes and figures that decorated them mimic the clothing and the architecture of the times in which they were created. In the same way, the Passover Seder itself has been a way for Jews to relate themselves to the biblical story of the Exodus, often by bringing up contemporary issues and ideas. Let's move on to the Christian Europe of the Middle Ages and see how it incorporated the content of its Bible, both the Old and New Testament, into its forms of cultural expression. Though most of the literature, prose, poetry, and plays that had been produced in the classical world did not survive into the Middle Ages, or was rejected because it was seen as pagan and ungodly, some of what did remain was very influential, and it was a common opinion at the time that no one could hope to match the feats that the ancients had accomplished in their art, literature, architecture, and philosophy. One of the most influential ancient works was the greatest Latin epic to be produced in the Roman world, the Aeneid of Virgil, which tells the story of the founding of Rome by Trojans who were fleeing the destruction of their city by the Greek army, whose exploits are described in Homer's Iliad. Even though the Aeneid was written several decades before the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth and refers to a number of Roman deities, its language and style shaped a lot of the Christian poetry of the centuries that followed it. In fact, Virgil was so popular during the Middle Ages that he appears as a character in one of its greatest works, the Divine Comedy of Dante. and around the same time, the English poet Geoffrey Chaucer used the story of Dido and Aeneas, which is the romantic core of Virgil's work, in his poem The House of Fame. It's not surprising, then, that a number of medieval Christian poets, who continued to compose their work in Latin, made use of the same poetic form, the hexameter, in which each line contains 6 feet, as Virgil did, and borrowed many of his words and phrases. Some of these works went even further. They were centos, which means that they were composed entirely of lines taken from a previous work, in this case the Aeneid. An early example of this technique was composed by Faltonia Proba, an aristocratic Roman woman of the 4th century CE who had converted to Christianity, which means that she may have had a classical education. Her work covered Genesis, Exodus, and the Gospels, but she adhered so closely to Virgil's phrasing that she decided to use vague terms like mother and father to refer to figures like Mary and God, since their names don't appear in Virgil. The resulting work was very popular during the Middle Ages. It was used in schools to teach the contents of the Bible, and it continued to be read during the Renaissance. In fact, it may be the very first work written by a woman to have been published in print. Another 4th century author, who's known as Cyprian, though his real name has been lost, wrote an epic based on the historical narrative of the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis through Kings, which, like Virgil's Aeneid, was written in hexameter form. Since it wasn't a cento, the author had more freedom to vary his choice of words, though the style of his text is still very similar to the Old Latin translation of the Bible, which was read in his time. The New Testament as well provided the raw material for creating new artistic works. From the 4th century, we have the poem called Evangeliorum Libri, which was written by a Spanish priest named Juvencus. It was based mainly on the Gospel of Matthew, with additional material taken from the other synoptic book. Juvencus also relies heavily on Virgil for his poetic style, though he criticizes both Virgil and Homer as lying pagans whom his own work was meant to combat. There was also a poetic rendition of the Book of Acts, written in the 6th century by a northern Italian man named Orator. Like the other works we've described, it doesn't attempt to be a comprehensive rewriting of the original text. Instead, it leaves out some episodes and expands on others, and adds the author's own interpretation of the events he considers important. Then there's a poetic version of part of one of the apocryphal books, 2nd Maccabee. This work, called the poem about the 7 Maccabean brothers killed by Antiochus at Epiphanes, singles out one of the most well-known passages of the Apocrypha, the story of how a Jewish woman's 7 sons were killed one after the other because they refused to violate their faith by eating pork. This episode became popular in the early church as a paradigm of the martyrdom the Christians themselves had come to experience. Late in the Middle Ages, another Greek drama was written, this one on a Christian theme, the Christos Paschon, or Suffering Christ. Like the work of Proba, this too was a cento, in this case based on the ancient Greek tragedians, and especially Euripides. The main character is Mary, which isn't surprising, as many Greek tragedies portrayed women as sympathetic characters bewailing their fate. But it also includes Jesus Christ, who makes a long speech about his theological significance while at the cross. Another interesting medieval version of the crucifixion is the Old English poem The Dream of the Rood, which describes it from the point of view of the tree which has been cut down to make the cross. The importance of the tree, which is itself sacrificed, suggests that the author was making use of pre-Christian ideas about the sacredness of trees and forests. Starting around the 16th century, the Renaissance saw the development of a number of new forms of art, including the beginnings of opera. Many of the earliest operas were written in the style called opera seria, or furious opera, which, like the painting of the time, took for their narrative either a classical myth or a story from the Bible. For example, The French composer Marc-Antoine Charpentier wrote in the 17th century an opera called David et Jonathan, which was based on the friendship between the young David and King Saul's son Jonathan in the book of Samuel. Another of these operas was the Story of Esther of the German Heinrich Schütz. Again, as with the painting of the time, the focus was not on the source material as such, but on how the artist might use it to express their aesthetic imagination. This is reflected in their choice of subject matter. For example, the close relationship of David and Jonathan, which ends when Jonathan dies in battle alongside his father, or the pathos of Esther pleading with the king to spare her people from the evil plans of his advisor Haman. One of the more interesting experiments from this period is also one of its most famous compositions, The Messiah of George Friedrich Handel. This piece is built almost entirely around passages from the Old Testament in the King James Version translation, which were chosen because they were seen as prefigurations of the story of Jesus. Each passage is accompanied by music designed to express its particular tone: joy, grief, solemnity, and so on. The decision to use the Hebrew Bible in a Christian setting fits with the Protestant emphasis on returning to the ancient roots of the faith. If the Messiah is one of the most influential pieces of music created during the Renaissance, then one of its most influential works of poetry is the Paradise Lost of John Milton. Like many earlier Christian works, this too was centered around the events of the first chapters of Genesis, and in particular, the story of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. And like the work of Virgil, Paradise Lost was a full-blown epic. But where Virgil had dealt with the origins of the Roman people, Milton was interested in the origins of the human condition. Rather than writing his work in Latin, like previous Christian works, Milton decided to write his work in English, which had only recently come to be accepted as a language fit for poetry and drama. And unlike those earlier works, he didn't limit himself to the content of the Bible itself. He re-envisioned the story of Adam and Eve as the expression of a cosmic war between the forces of good, God's angels, and the fallen angel Satan with his army of demons, who were the gods worshipped by pagans like the Egyptians and the Canaanites. Just as artists like Michelangelo had been depicting God in human terms, Milton includes him as a character in his epic. But he's not the central or even the most interesting character in the story. Since he already knows what's going to happen, he can't be subject to irony or undergo any personal development or transformation, nor can he be challenged or endangered in any way. This places him above the action in which Adam and Eve are tempted and the two forces in heaven go to war. Instead, the true hero, or rather the anti-hero of the story, is Satan, who has literally fallen from grace, and in his rage and grief takes on a battle he knows he can't win. This theme is so powerful that it continues to echo in similar modern characters. After the novel, which comes from the word for new, developed as a form of literary expression in the late 18th century, some authors used it to reinterpret stories from the Bible. Some of these novelists have continued in the tradition of the artists and poets who drew on the Bible as a source of powerful imagery and character, which they used for their own artistic end, while others have been Christians who wanted to publicize their faith through literature, which may be more appealing and digestible than the Bible itself, even in its modern translations. But most of these novels are set in the world of the New Testament. Some of them do draw on the Hebrew Bible, which their authors tend to see as a positive influence on Western values and culture. For example, in his novel Joseph and His Brothers, the mid-20th century German writer Thomas Mann rewrites the story of Joseph in Egypt by drawing on the scholarship of his time. Mann emphasizes the role of myth in the Mesopotamian roots of the Genesis narrative, and he suggests that the Israelites were responsible for creating the idea of monotheism, which was a common belief in 19th century Europe. Though he does draw some parallels between the Joseph story and the narrative of the Gospels, Mann's work paints the sympathetic portrait of Jewish culture and its contributions to Western civilization. Some modern Jewish authors have also taken epithet in the Hebrew Bible for their source material. For example, Joseph Heller's novel God Knows is based on episodes in David's life taken from the book of Samuel. But at the same time, Heller draws on the same contemporary Jewish culture in which some of his other work is set, and the book has the sarcastic and ironic tone we often find in modern Jewish humor. A very different approach is taken by the novel The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, which expands on the story of Dinah, one of Jacob's two wives, about whom the book of Genesis has very little to say. In addition to adding a lot of new material to her story, the novel emphasizes the role, fellowship, and concerns of women who are generally treated as secondary figures in the biblical narrative. On the other hand, Chronicles of the Kings is a series of novels published by a Christian press, which are set in the time of the Judean king Hezekiah, the 7th century BCE. Though they are strictly speaking concerned with the world of Israelite faith, their heroes are engaged in the struggle against idolatry, which some contemporary Christians also see as their challenge in a modern secular world. There are, of course, many more novels set in the world of the New Testament, and specifically the Gospel. One of the most popular of these was Ben-Hur, which was first published in 1880 by Lew Wallace. Though it begins with the birth of Jesus, it mainly tells the story of Judah Ben-Hur, a Jewish hero who grows up around the same time and after many adventures witnesses the crucifixion and in the end decides to become a Christian. The novel's approach is more positive and respectful than the Gospels are about the Jewish society in which Jesus' story takes place, though Ben-Hur's conversion is ultimately a claim of Christian superiority. A very different sort of biblical novel is The Gospel According to Jesus Christ, which was published by Jose Saramago in 1991. It focuses on the early part of Jesus' life, which is not covered in the Gospels. In this version of the story, Jesus interacts with Satan all of his life, and he does not want to carry out the mission assigned to him. He feels guilt about all the other infants who were killed by Herod when he was born, and he knows that the faith launched by his death on the cross will bring suffering to others. And whereas most of the popular renditions of the crucifixion end with Jesus saying, as he does in the Gospel of Luke, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," Saramago has him say, "Men, forgive him, for he knows not what he has done." But the most controversial of the novels that describe the life and the mission of Jesus is Nikos Kazantzakis' Last Temptation of Christ from 1965. In the novel, and in the Martin Scorsese film which is based on it, Jesus is a regular person with the same internal conflict as everyone else, who struggles to carry out the mission he has been saddled with. And while on the cross, he's given the opportunity to see what a normal life would be like for him if he should decide to abandon his sacrifice. In the end, Jesus does decide to go through with the crucifixion, because only then will his message have a lasting effect on the world. Let's finish with some examples of how the Bible has been represented in visual culture. An early and interesting case of this was the work of Fred Holland Day, a photographer of the late 19th century who was one of a group that saw the new technology as a form of artistic expression. To that end, Day composed photographs on both classical and biblical themes, just as classical painters had always done. And since the events surrounding the crucifixion, as we saw in our last lecture, were such an abiding theme of Western painting, Day made his own effort to record them by staging his own version with himself as Jesus. Then, of course, there are the many movies that dramatize episodes from both the Old and New Testaments. Like every effort to bring a written work to the screen, these movies face the challenge of how to translate a literary medium to a visual one. After all, the people who make movies always say that their goal is show, don't tell. This may be why the stories chosen for these films either lend themselves to grand spectacle or have been turned into it. The height of such spectacle was the 1950s and 60s, when Technicolor technology and panoramic camera lenses made possible the production of epics like Cleopatra and Lawrence of Arabia. Some of these epics were Bible stories. From the Old Testament, for example, we have David and Bathsheba, 1951, Solomon and Sheba, 1959, and of course the Ten Commandments, 1956. As we can see from the first two titles, the stories they chose were centered around romances, just as many operas and plays have been. And because they're about kings, they can steep themselves in the grandeur of an ancient royal court. The Ten Commandments, on the other hand, is built around two awesome visual spectacles: the crossing of the Red Sea, when the waters part so that the Israelites can walk through, and Moses receiving the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai, which even in the Bible is a very picturesque moment. Some of the more recent films based on the Old Testament have taken a different approach. 1985's King David, for example, uses more natural lighting and settings than an epic did, and its characters speak more like regular people, instead of in the grandiose tones used by actors like Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. Then there is Darren Aronofsky's Noah from 2014, which distances itself from the text of Genesis by taking the idea of the Watchers from the Book of Enoch and adding conflicts among the members of Noah's family. The movie also changes the reason for the flood, from the wickedness of human beings to the destruction of the environment, which had to be cleansed of them in order to recover. Aronofsky also gives us an account of the creation story at the start of Genesis, which is put in more scientifically accurate terms. And here the problem with Adam and Eve is not that they gained knowledge forbidden to them, but that, like the apes at the beginning of Stanley Kubrick's 2001, they now know how to kill. Of all of the biblical characters portrayed in film, there are three in particular who generated a lot of attention across various artistic media: the Herodian princess Salome, the Israelite hero Samson, and Jesus himself. The story of Salome begins with a play written by Oscar Wilde in 1893, which emphasizes her seductiveness and love of beauty. Though the story of how she asked Herod to give her the head of John the Baptist is based on an account in Matthew 14, the gospel itself doesn't say anything about her feelings for John or why she wanted him killed. Wilde, on the other hand, has her dance the dance of the seven veils in exchange for John's head because she wants to possess his beauty. In an early film version of the story, Salome from 1918, she is a power-hungry woman who is angry at John for rejecting her, but by 1953, when the story was remade yet again as a Hollywood epic, Salome had become the hero. She is moved by John's preaching to convert to Christianity, and it's her mother Herodias who wants John killed. Samson, on the other hand, first appears in popular culture in 1671, when John Milton made him the sympathetic hero of his tragedy, Samson Agonistes. Milton chose the story of Samson for its tragic theme, as in the book of Judges, he dies by pulling down on himself a Philistine temple where he has been blinded and chained up after being led astray by Delilah, who has taken away his strength by cutting his hair. In 1949, one of the main producers of these epics, Cecil B. DeMille, made the film Samson and Delilah, in which Delilah is again more sympathetic than she was in the Bible itself. She only agrees to chap Samson because she blames him for the deaths of her sister and father, but she comes to regret her decision and even helps him to destroy the temple at the cost of her own life. In the 1960s, Samson became the focus of a number of Italian movies featuring bodybuilders. Their characters were sometimes called Matute in Italy, though they could also be called Samson or Hercules or Goliath, with no particular concerns about the setting of the story. Among these films were Samson, 1961, Samson versus the Pirates, 1963, Samson Challenges Hercules, 1963, Samson versus the Black Pirate, 1963, and Samson and His Mighty Challenge, 1965. This brings us to the portrayal of Jesus as a character. The problem of how to turn the faultless hero of a text considered sacred into a compelling and emotionally moving character has been around since Paradise Lost, and many of the critics of films based on the Gospels have found the character of Jesus to be far too dull and high-minded to be of any interest. In fact, these films tend not to focus on Jesus himself as a dramatic character, and unlike the paintings and illustrations we saw in the last lecture, which portray events from throughout Jesus' life, the movies tend to focus on the crucifixion and the resurrection. For example, The Robe from 1953 is about a Roman soldier who takes possession of Jesus' garment after the crucifixion and the effect it has on his life. In fact, many of these films avoid showing Jesus directly, even though the New Testament itself describes him as a concrete human being. The silent film version of Ben-Hur from 1925 includes a number of scenes with Jesus, though he's only seen indirectly or from a distance. In the 1959 version, with Charlton Heston, we see the three magi visiting Mary in the manger. Then later on, we see Jesus from behind at the Sermon on the Mount, again from behind at his trial before Pilate, and being crucified near the end of the film. And in the final scene, Judah tells his family that he heard Jesus say, "Father, forgive them." Some other film, like King of Kings from 1961, do try to cover the entire part of Jesus' life as described in the Gospel, i.e. his birth and his activities as an adult, though it only includes snippets of actual dialogue from the text. An interesting exception to this trend is the Italian film of Pier Paolo Pasolini, The Gospel According to Matthew from 1964. This is a black and white, stark, neorealist film made with non-actors in old towns in southern Italy, in which many of the characters are dressed in stylized costumes. All of the dialogue is taken directly from the text of Matthew, and the film jumps abruptly from one scene to the next, just as the Gospel jumps from one chapter to the next. The character of Jesus is very down-to-earth here, and in fact is almost always angry or scowling. Aside from Scorsese's Last Temptation, the most controversial portrayal of the Gospel story is Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ from 2004. But it's controversial for entirely different reasons. Where Scorsese gives us a very troubled and uncertain Jesus, Gibson gives us a suffering one. Almost all of the story is about Jesus' last day, with only brief flashbacks to the Last Supper and the Sermon on the Mount, and the main focus is on his torture and execution. In this, as in other respects, the film tries to set a much more realistic tone than other films about the Gospel story. The characters speak in Aramaic and Latin, the colors are mostly natural shades of brown, and the lighting is dim. But as the movie's title suggests, Jesus himself is portrayed more as the Christ of later church theology than as a human being of his own time, and the film ends with the resurrection and with a particular emphasis on his wounds. Once this subculture of Bible-themed movies had come to an end, it presented a ripe target for satire, and this we have in Life of Brian from 1979. Jesus is in the background here too, at the Nativity and at the Sermon on the Mount, though instead of introducing characters like Ben-Hur, whose lives intersect with him, it gives us Brian, whose life parallels Jesus to the bitter end. And there are lots of visual and musical parallels to the epic films of the 50s and 60s, more or less. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of this journey. My next project is going to be about the history of the imagination, from the earliest myths to modern science fiction. Please remember to like and subscribe.